colleagues are passionate about. And I want to work with you and others to get this a solution that works. I also want to echo what I think a number of my colleagues have said about IRS enforceability. The easiest way we can start down this path is to make sure the IRS gets back to its capabilities it had, for example, under President Bush, which means it's going to need some of these resources. You know, I've been thinking a lot about this, and you know, I think it's a hard thing to kind of come to a conclusion on. I think we got to. I appreciate the comments from the panel. If we're going to do this, it's got to be fair. It's got to be simple. It's got to be comprehensive. We got to find a way to make sure that folks don't game the system. As somebody who was lucky enough to be an entrepreneur myself, and then as a venture guy funding a lot of entrepreneurs, I think we need to make sure we don't stamp out that growth piece of our economy. And I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, that you've actually got the buy, borrow, and die platform up there, because that's where I want to dig in, and I think Mr. Pearl actually made reference to that. I want to focus on the borrow piece, because one of the things I still struggle with is some of the proposals that put a tax in place without a realization event. And I can't find other examples of that in other nation states. But I do think the nature of our tax codes, that you can borrow against your assets, oftentimes liquid stock assets that some of the best billionaires around do that on a regular basis, and then you know, they ultimately die and they pass on those assets without any realization event, yet they have used the system to fund their lavish lifestyles. And I guess I'll start, Ms. Wong, maybe go down the panel, but this notion of, particularly if you're borrowing for lifestyle as opposed to borrowing to make an additional acquisition, I think is an area that has some difference. And I do think there's been some recent testimony that has indicated that there might be a lot more with the appropriate use of borrowing as a realization event with assets of certain size might obtain a lot more tax revenue than previously thought. So, Ms. Wong, then we'll go down the list.
Yeah, so I think you're just sort of putting your finger on the fact that billionaires can spend their untaxed capital gains income, and that's most obvious when they're borrowing against it and they're purchasing things with it. It really just sort of puts a finger on the point that this is income in the real world. It's not just some theory that us lawyers and economists have dreamed up, but they're real world resources that can be used, and it's just the tax system that's currently ignoring that resource. And you're correct that there are lots of options for addressing this. Some of them include taxing those gains closer to when they're made. Some of them focus on that sort of consumption out of that wealth. And I think they deserve serious study. What isn't sound is just a system where that income can evaporate out of the tax code altogether.
Which is obviously the case, and we can all list lots of people who use that tool. Mr. Pearl?
Yeah, I agree with what Ms. Wong said. Essentially, if I'm able to borrow money against my brokerage account, as long as the stocks that I own increase in value at a higher rate than the interest on the account, I'm still becoming wealthy over time. The broker's perfectly happy to see a debit balance increase indefinitely for my entire life. And it's essentially economically the same as a realization event, except it's not taxable. And yeah, so I agree with you.
Dr. McBride?
I would point out in these scenarios that are being described here that we're talking about corporate stock, I think, is the primary example, and that's because that is, you look at the wealthiest individuals in the country by whatever, you know, publication is doing that analysis, they do tend to be entrepreneurs that have built a business that is subject to, you got it, the corporate tax. So I think it's what's missing in these discussions is that even if the individual is not, that holds shares in these companies, and we're talking about founders typically that have a lot of shares, that if they don't realize by selling the stock in any given year, that doesn't mean they pay no tax, because every year the company that they own is subject to corporate tax, 21% on income.
Yeah, but the actual tax, as you know, Dr. Bride, is functionally much lower than that. I probably should have gone the opposite way on this, but Dr. Holtz-Eaton, I know my time is up, but please.
Well,
I mean, the key, as you mentioned, is to maintain these incentives for growth. And so we've had in the code full expensing of investments, capital investments, investments in technologies and business models. And that's a fantastic growth incentive. It's very important to have. It also changes the effective tax rate on the normal rate of return to 0, which I think is fine. I'm a zero tax on capital guy. If you allow them to borrow and make that investment, the effective tax rate's negative. No. So you give them the growth incentive. Don't also allow them to do the interest deductibility. Get the effective tax rate down as low as possible and get rid of these avoidance opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Welcome. I think I had a chance to say hello to each of you before the hearing started. And I've missed up a good part of it, but I'm here now. I'm happy to see all of you. Thank you for spending this time with us. I used to be state treasurer, elected treasurer when I was 29 years old. Nobody else wanted to run. We had the worst credit rating in the country. Elected a governor, a Republican named Pete DuPont. He turned out to be a great governor, a good mentor for me. And he